The courtroom inside Caldwell, Kansas smelled like sawdust, gun oil, and the particular brand of desperation that only surfaces when a man knows he has been caught. It was the autumn of 1882, and the circuit judge's traveling bench had been set up inside the largest building Caldwell possessed, which was the grain exchange on the corner of Main and Prairie, its plank walls shaking faintly against an October wind that had no mercy in it. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with ranchers, homesteaders, merchants, and the kind of idle, curious men who had nothing better to do than watch the powerful eat the powerless. But today, something was different. Today, the powerless had a champion, and that champion stood 6 feet and 2 inches tall, with a jaw like quarried granite and eyes the color of a winter sky just before the snow comes in hard and stays. Sheriff Roy Whitaker walked to the center of that creaking floor, his boots marking each step with the weight of absolute certainty, and he turned those winter sky eyes directly on Circuit Judge Harlan Moorfield, who sat behind a borrowed desk with the expression of a man who had already made up his mind before a single word of testimony had been offered. "Your Honor," Roy said, and his voice carried to every corner of that packed room without effort, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard, accustomed to being obeyed, but most of all accustomed to telling the truth even when the truth was a loaded rifle pointed at his own chest. "That deed was stolen, and I have the witness to prove it." The room erupted. Cornelius Hargrove, cattle baron and the most feared man in 3 counties, rose from his seat at the plaintiff's table so fast that his lawyer, a slick-haired man from Wichita named Aldous Webb, had to grab his arm to keep him from crossing the floor. Hargrove's face had gone from the deep brick red of a man accustomed to outdoor power to something closer to purple, the color of a man whose carefully constructed world was tearing apart at the seams. "That is an outrage," Hargrove thundered, and his voice had the quality of a man who had never once in his 58 years been contradicted in public. "This sheriff is nothing but a paid lackey for that woman, and everyone in this county knows it." Judge Moorfield raised a hand, not with the authority of justice, but with the nervous caution of a man who had taken money from the wrong side, and was only now beginning to understand the weight of that transaction. "Sheriff Whitaker, this is highly irregular. The deed in question has already been entered into evidence, properly notarized and registered with the county clerk in June of this year." "That notarization is fraudulent," Roy said, not raising his voice, not flinching, his jaw set in that particular way that had earned him his reputation across 4 counties, "and the witness I have can testify to how, when, and by whose hand that fraud was committed." From the back of the room, Wilhelmina Turner sat straight as a fence post in the 3rd row of gallery seating, her hands folded in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had gone white against the dark green wool of her dress. She was 26 years old, and she had the kind of beauty that was not soft or decorative but rather fierce and luminous, the way a flame is beautiful, all light and edge and heat. Her dark brown hair was pinned up beneath a practical hat, and her gray-green eyes moved between Roy's broad back and Hargrove's furious face with the calculation of a woman who had survived this far by reading rooms and reading men and understanding, when everything she had ever worked for was balanced on a single moment. This was that moment. And to understand how they had arrived here, standing on opposite sides of an abyss that was also somehow a beginning, you had to go back 6 weeks, to the afternoon Wilhelmina Turner had first walked into Roy Whitaker's office with a stolen deed in her hand and rage in her heart, and no idea that her life was about to change in ways that had nothing at all to do with land. The Comanche County line sat 40 miles south of Caldwell, and the town of Red Rock, which was barely a town at all, more of a suggestion of civilization scratched into the Kansas prairie, was where Wilhelmina had built her life since arriving from St. Louis at the age of 19. She had come west with her father, Harold Turner, a stubborn and visionary man who had believed with his entire soul in the Homestead Act of 1862 and what it promised to ordinary people willing to work extraordinary land. He had filed his claim in 1875, and he had spent 7 years breaking that land into something that grew wheat and cattle and hope in roughly equal measure. When Harold Turner died of a fever in the spring of 1882, he left Wilhelmina 320 acres, a small herd of 20 cattle, a farmhouse that he had built himself from lumber hauled 40 miles by wagon, and the deed to all of it, which he had pressed into her hands with the last of his coherent strength and told her to guard with her life. She had understood that this was not sentiment. This was instruction. Cornelius Hargrove had been eyeing the Turner land for years. It sat at the intersection of two creek beds that never ran dry, which made it the most reliably watered piece of privately held land in the county. And Hargrove's expanding cattle empire needed water the way all empires need the thing that makes them grow. He had made Harold Turner 2 offers while the old man was alive, both of which had been declined with the kind of quiet, implacable dignity that had made Harold Turner a man of respect even among those who had no love for small homesteaders. With Harold in the ground, Hargrove had apparently decided that his patience had run out and that there were faster methods available to a man of his resources. In August of 1882, when Wilhelmina had gone to Wichita to settle her father's remaining debts with the bank, someone had broken into her farmhouse. They had taken nothing obvious. No silver, no cash, nothing that a common thief would have wanted. They had taken only one thing from the locked strongbox beneath her father's old desk, and that thing was the deed to 320 acres of the finest watered land in Comanche County. She had returned home to find the strongbox's lock broken and the deed gone, and she had sat down at her father's kitchen table in the empty farmhouse and allowed herself exactly 1 hour of the grief and fury that the situation warranted. Then she had stood up, straightened her spine, saddled her horse, and ridden 40 miles north to Caldwell, because Caldwell was where the county seat was, where the circuit judge would be riding through in 3 weeks, and where the only lawman in 4 counties with a reputation for being neither bought nor broken kept his office. Roy Whitaker had been sheriff of Sumner County for 4 years when Wilhelmina Turner pushed open the door of his office on a Tuesday afternoon in September and changed both their lives with a single sentence. He was 31 years old. A Missouri native who had come west after the war's aftermath had made the East feel too small and too haunted for a man of his particular constitution. He had tried cattle driving, failed to be interested in it, tried farming, found himself better suited to the protection of farms than the working of them, and had fallen into law enforcement the way some men fall into rivers, all at once, and then discovered that they are unexpectedly good at swimming. He was sitting at his desk reading the week's Caldwell Post when the door opened, and he looked up from the paper and registered, in the way that a man registers something that will matter for the rest of his life, the presence of Wilhelmina Turner. She was trail-dusty from the ride, her hat was crooked, and her gray-green eyes were carrying approximately 120 miles worth of banked fury. "Are you Sheriff Whitaker?" she asked, in a voice that was entirely composed and entirely fierce, which Roy would later reflect was the most arresting combination of qualities he had ever encountered in a single person. "I am," he said, and stood, because whatever else Roy Whitaker was, he had been raised to stand when a woman entered a room. "My name is Wilhelmina Turner," she said. "My land is about to be stolen from me by Cornelius Hargrove, and I need you to stop it." Roy had heard that sentence, or a version of it, at least a dozen times in his 4 years as sheriff. Hargrove had been systematically acquiring land across the county for years, using methods that ranged from legitimate purchase to pressured sales to outright intimidation. Roy had investigated 3 prior complaints against Hargrove and had found himself blocked each time by the particular combination of well-placed bribery, legal maneuvering, and the simple cold fact that Hargrove owned 2 members of the county commission and had the ear of at least one judge. He had spent considerable energy being frustrated by this fact. But something in the specific quality of Wilhelmina Turner's fury made him set his newspaper down and give her his full attention in a way that went beyond professional courtesy. She told him the story in clean, unadorned sentences, the way a person tells a story when they have been rehearsing it in their head for 40 miles of riding and have stripped away everything except the essential facts. Roy listened without interrupting, which was a skill he had developed deliberately and valued greatly, and when she finished, he asked her 4 questions in rapid succession. When did she leave for Wichita? When did she return? Who knew she would be traveling? And had she seen, on the new deed that Hargrove had apparently already filed with the county clerk, the date of purported sale? To that last question, she slammed a folded paper onto his desk, the copy of the filing that the county clerk, a nervous young man named Pettigrew who was genuinely embarrassed by the whole business, had given her when she had arrived demanding to know how a deed to her father's land had been transferred to Cornelius Hargrove's holding company without her knowledge or signature. Roy unfolded the paper and read it carefully. The deed transfer was dated June 14, 1882, more than 2 months before Harold Turner had died. It purported to show that Harold Turner had sold the land voluntarily to the Hargrove Land and Cattle Company for the sum of $800. Roy looked up from the paper and found Wilhelmina Turner's eyes, which were watching him with an intensity that was equal parts desperate hope and iron-spined refusal to beg. "Your father was alive in June," Roy said. "He was alive," she confirmed. "He was sick. He died in April." Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That deed is dated after your father's death and it claims to represent a transaction that occurred while he was living. That is not just theft, that is forgery." "I know what it is," Wilhelmina said. "What I need to know is whether you are going to do something about it." Roy Whitaker looked at this woman with her dusty clothes and her borrowed fury and her absolute refusal to be defeated, and he felt something shift in the foundational architecture of his chest. Something quiet and significant that he chose not to examine too closely in that moment, because there was work to be done and he was a professional. "Yes," he said, "I am going to do something about it." What he did not tell her, not yet, was that he understood precisely what doing something about it would cost. Hargrove had resources, connections, and a fundamental belief that men of property and influence operated by different rules than ordinary people. He had, as Roy knew from personal experience, no compunction about making problems disappear through whatever means were most expedient. Roy had 2 deputies, one of whom was reliable and one of whom he was no longer certain about. He had a jurisdiction that ended at the county line, and he had approximately 3 weeks before the circuit judge arrived. He told Wilhelmina to stay in Caldwell, found her a room at Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house on the north side of town, and went to work. The first thing he needed was a witness. The forgery itself was clever and nearly impeccable, clearly the work of a professional forger rather than a rancher's hired hand, which told Roy that Hargrove had brought in outside talent, which in turn told him the scheme had been planned with more care than most frontier land grabs. The notary whose seal appeared on the fraudulent deed was a man named Orville Fitch, who kept an office in Wichita and was, so far as Roy knew, a legitimate practitioner of that trade. Getting to Fitch meant leaving the county, which meant Roy could not go himself without leaving Caldwell uncovered. He sent a letter to the marshal in Wichita asking for a background inquiry on Orville Fitch, using the careful, measured language that official correspondence required, while making the urgency between the lines as clear as he knew how to make it. What he needed in the meantime was someone local, someone who might have seen something, someone who occupied the invisible spaces between the powerful and the powerless and who might, if approached correctly, be willing to step into the dangerous light of testimony. It was his deputy, the reliable one whose name was Samuel Birch, a compact and observant man of 28 who had grown up in the county and knew everyone in it, who gave Roy the thread he needed. "Pettigrew," Samuel said, when Roy laid out the problem one morning over the cold coffee that constituted most of their strategic conversations. "The county clerk. He didn't like filing that deed. I could see it on him when I passed his office the day after it got filed. He had the look of a man who had done something he knows is wrong and is waiting to see if the sky falls on him for it." Roy considered this. Pettigrew was young, perhaps 24, and had held his clerk position for less than a year. He was not a corrupt man by nature. He was, Roy suspected, a frightened one. Meanwhile, across town, Wilhelmina Turner was not staying quietly in her boarding house room the way Roy had suggested. She was not, as he would come to understand completely, a woman constituted for quiet inaction. She had gone to the county record's office herself, spent 2 days methodically reviewing land transfer records, and had identified not one but 3 other land transfers that bore suspicious similarity to the circumstances of her father's deed. 3 small homesteaders, 2 of them elderly, one of them a widow, all of whom had apparently sold their properties to Hargrove companies in the last 18 months under circumstances that did not, upon careful examination, add up. She brought this information to Roy on a Thursday evening, appearing at his office door just as the sun was going down, her arms full of copied records and her expression, the focused, purposeful look of a woman who had been doing the work she needed done, because waiting for someone else to do it was not in her nature. Roy looked at the records spread across his desk, looked at the pattern she had identified, and felt 2 things simultaneously. A professional recognition that she had just materially strengthened the case he was building, and a personal recognition, warm and inconvenient, that this woman was extraordinary in ways that had very little to do with land deeds. "Where did you get these?" he asked. "The records office is open to the public," she said, sitting down across from him without being invited, which he found he did not mind at all. "I spent 12 cents on paper and an afternoon with a clerk who was very helpful once I explained that I was doing historical research." "You lied to a county clerk," Roy said, but there was no reproach in it. "I told him I was researching the history of land transfers in the county," Wilhelmina said. "That is precisely what I was doing." Roy looked at her across the lamplight that had become necessary as the evening deepened around them, and he smiled, which was a thing his face did rarely enough that Samuel Birch, had he been present, would have marked it as significant. "You would have made a good detective," he said. "I would have made a good lawyer," she corrected, without heat, simply as a statement of fact, and Roy felt the truth of it entirely. They talked for 2 hours that evening, which began as a working conversation about the case and gradually, without either of them quite deciding to allow it, became something else. She told him about her father's vision for the land, the wheat he had grown, the cattle he had bred, the farmhouse he had built board by board with a stubbornness that she had inherited completely. He told her about Missouri, about the years after the war when the countryside had felt haunted by things that had no name, about the particular quality of the Kansas sky that he had found, to his surprise, genuinely healing. When she left, Roy sat in his quiet office for a long time, not reading, not working, just being aware of the profound and somewhat alarming fact that something had happened to him in those 2 hours, something irreversible and completely outside the jurisdiction of his professional discipline. He was falling in love with Wilhelmina Turner. He recognized this with the same direct, undecorated clarity with which he recognized most things, and he immediately set it aside, because there was a case to build and a woman's livelihood to protect, and he had no business letting his personal feelings complicate either of those facts. This resolution lasted approximately 48 hours. On Saturday morning, he found her at the grain exchange, where she had apparently been having a conversation with 3 older homesteaders whose lands had bordered her father's claim, gathering testimony about Harold Turner's character, and his absolute, documented refusal to ever consider selling his land under any circumstances. When Roy arrived, she was in the middle of an animated discussion about irrigation patterns, her hat in her hand and her dark hair catching the morning light, and she turned and saw him, and the quality of her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, just enough that he was aware of it, and she was aware that he was aware of it. It was the beginning of something neither of them had the luxury of pursuing just then, which made it both more intense and more impossible to ignore. The letter from the Wichita Marshal arrived 4 days later, and it contained information that changed everything. Orville Fitch, the notary whose seal appeared on the fraudulent deed, had a history that the Wichita authorities were quite interested in. He had been investigated twice for fraudulent notarizations in his previous practice in Topeka, both times without sufficient evidence for prosecution. But more crucially, the Wichita Marshal's inquiry had turned up the fact that Fitch had been seen in Caldwell in late August, staying at the Drovers Hotel for 3 nights, and that he had been seen in conversation with Aldous Webb, who was Hargrove's attorney. Roy had a forger, a corrupt attorney, and a pattern of fraudulent transfers. What he did not yet have was someone who could testify to the specific transaction on Wilhelmina's deed, someone who had been present, and could confirm that what was represented as a legal sale was in fact a manufactured document. Then Samuel Birch came to him with news about Pettigrew. The young county clerk had apparently been drinking heavily at the Prairie Dog Saloon for the past 2 weeks, which was itself a departure from his usual modest habits, and had been overheard by at least 2 people saying things that a man in his position had no reason to say unless he was carrying a guilt that had become too heavy for him. Roy went to see Pettigrew himself, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon that kept most of Caldwell indoors and gave the streets a gray, private quality that felt appropriate. He found the clerk in his office, alone, staring at a ledger he was clearly not reading, and Roy sat down across from him and said, in the quiet, direct tone that he had found more effective than any variation of threat or pressure, "I know you did not want to file that deed, Pettigrew. I know you knew something was wrong with it, and I know that whatever Hargrove or Webb told you to keep you from refusing, you have been thinking about it every day since." Pettigrew did not deny any of this. He was pale and young and visibly miserable, and Roy felt something close to compassion for him, alongside the necessary professional distance. "Told me the deed was legitimate," Pettigrew said, not looking up. "Webb, he told me the old man had signed it before he died, that the family had contested it out of grief and confusion, but that it was legal and I had to file it." "And you believed him," Roy said. "I wanted to believe him," Pettigrew said, which was the most honest thing Roy had heard anyone say in some time. "I needed to believe him. I have a family, Sheriff. I have a wife and a young child, and this job is all we have." "And now," Roy said. Pettigrew finally looked up, and his eyes had the particular quality of a man who has been trying to live with a lie and has reached the point where the lie is more expensive than the truth. "Webb brought Fitch to my office. I was there when Fitch sealed the document. I heard Webb tell Fitch the date to use on the notarization. I saw the whole thing." Roy was quiet for a moment, allowing the weight of what he had just been told to settle into the room. Then he said, "I need you to testify to that, Pettigrew." In front of the circuit judge. "They will destroy me," Pettigrew said, and his voice had the flat quality of a man stating a fact rather than making an objection. "They will try," Roy said, "but the circuit judge's authority supersedes anything Hargrove's money can do locally, and if you testify truthfully, you are protected by that authority. I will see to it personally." "And if something happens before the hearing?" Pettigrew asked. "Nothing will happen to you," Roy said. "I give you my word on that." He meant it, and keeping it would require things from him that he had not yet fully calculated. He told Wilhelmina that evening, when she came to his office with more notes from her own investigation, and the focused energy of a woman who had turned her grief and fury into something that could be aimed. He watched her face as he told her about Pettigrew, watched the relief move through her like water through dry earth, and then watched something else, something more complicated and more private, move through the gray-green depths of her eyes. "He was there," she said. "He witnessed the whole thing." "Every detail," Roy confirmed. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "My father never would have sold that land. He died for that land, in the sense that he worked himself to death on it because he believed in what it meant, not just as property but as a life, as the life he wanted me to have after he was gone." "I know," Roy said, and in his voice there was a gentleness that his professional tone usually carefully covered, a gentleness that was entirely personal and entirely real. She looked at him with that directness that was one of the things he found most compelling about her, the way she looked at people as though she had decided that anything less than full honesty was a waste of time they did not have. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You have made this case your primary concern for 2 weeks. You have written to other marshals. You have found a witness. You have built something that could put you directly in opposition to the most powerful man in this county. You could have taken my complaint, noted it, told me the legal process would take its course, and gone back to your newspaper." Roy thought about what to say to this and then said the truth, because it was the only currency he knew how to trade in and because she deserved it. "Because what is being done to you is wrong," he said. "And because I am the person in this town whose specific purpose is to make wrong things right, regardless of who has made them wrong. That is the first part of the answer." She waited, because she could hear the shape of a second part. "And because," he said, meeting her eyes without flinching, "I have not been able to think about very much else since you walked into my office." The silence that followed was one of the most significant silences Roy Whitaker had ever occupied. He watched Wilhelmina Turner process what he had said with that fierce, honest intelligence, and he watched her decide not to deflect it or diminish it or convert it into something safer. "I think," she said carefully, "that I should tell you that I came to Caldwell in a state of considerable desperation, having lost my father and now facing the loss of everything he built, and that I have been in this town for nearly 3 weeks in a state of anxiety that does not always allow for clarity about what one is feeling." "That is a fair observation," Roy said. "And also," she continued, her voice dropping just slightly in the way voices drop when they are carrying something real, "that I have spent more of the last 3 weeks thinking about you than is strictly necessary for the purposes of building a legal case." Roy found that his jaw, which was not in the habit of relaxing, had relaxed somewhat. The 10 days before the circuit judge arrived were an education in the difference between building a case and protecting a case. Roy's instinct had been right about the danger. Hargrove knew something was wrong, knew that his careful scheme was facing opposition more competent than he had anticipated, and he began to apply pressure through every channel available to him. 2 men arrived from outside the county and took up residence at the Drovers Hotel, men with the particular manner and equipment of professional trouble, and Roy had Samuel Birch keep quiet watch on them while he kept quiet watch on Pettigrew. The county commissioner, who was in Hargrove's pocket, paid Roy an official visit and suggested, with elaborate courtesy, that the sheriff's energies might be better directed toward matters unambiguously within his jurisdiction. Roy thanked him for his visit and showed him the door. Aldous Webb made an appearance at Pettigrew's home one evening, which Samuel reported to Roy within the hour, and Roy went to Pettigrew the next morning and moved him and his small family to a room above the jail that was technically a guest accommodation for visiting lawmen, but had a solid lock on the door and Roy's personal presence in the building below. Pettigrew's wife, a quiet woman named Clara who was holding her infant son with the specific fierce calm of a mother who understands exactly what kind of world she is navigating, looked at Roy when he explained the situation and said, "If Pettigrew testifies and you protect us like you have promised, then I want your word not just as a sheriff but as a man." "You have both," Roy said. What he had not anticipated was that Hargrove would choose a different target entirely. On a Thursday evening, 9 days before the hearing, Wilhelmina Turner left Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house to walk to the Mercantile 3 blocks away and encountered one of Hargrove's professional men on a deserted stretch of the route. He did not touch her. He was considerably more sophisticated than that. He simply walked alongside her for half a block and told her, in a conversational tone, that the hearing was going to go badly for her, that the witness she thought she had was going to discover prior commitments, and that a substantial sum of money had been placed in her name at the Caldwell Savings Bank, enough to begin a comfortable new life somewhere considerably east of Kansas, and that the offer had a short expiration. Wilhelmina Turner continued walking to the Mercantile, made her purchase, walked back to the boarding house, and then went directly to the jail where she found Roy reviewing the case documents and told him, in clipped, precise sentences, exactly what had happened. Roy was on his feet before she finished speaking, the professional stillness that usually governed his movements replaced by something sharper and more personal. "Did he threaten you directly?" Roy asked. "He strongly implied it," she said. "He was careful. He is not unintelligent." "Are you all right?" Roy asked, and the question had nothing to do with the case, and they both understood that. "I am angry," Wilhelmina said. "I am very, very angry, but I am not frightened." Roy looked at her in the lamplight of the jail office. This woman who had ridden 40 miles alone to fight for what was hers, who had spent 3 weeks building evidence and testimony, while navigating threats she had not asked for and had not deserved, and who was standing in front of him right now with her chin up and her eyes fierce, and not a single degree of surrender anywhere in her posture. And he felt something so complete and so certain move through him that it was almost like a physical thing. "Wilhelmina," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and the quality of it in the silence between them was something neither of them would forget. "Roy," she said, and her voice was different, softer and more direct simultaneously, the way things are when armor is laid down deliberately rather than lost. He crossed the room in 2 steps and she met him halfway, which was both practical and exactly right. And when he kissed her, it was with the particular honesty of a man who had been carrying something too heavy to hold at arm's length anymore. And when she kissed him back, it was with the fierce, certain quality of a woman who makes no decision without conviction and changes no mind once made. They stayed in that kiss for a long moment, the lamp burning quietly between them and the wind outside pressing against the windows of the jail office. And when they separated, they were both slightly altered, slightly more themselves in the way people become more themselves when they stop pretending. "I should tell you," Roy said, his voice carrying a new quality that went beyond professional steadiness into something warmer and more permanent, "that I have not felt this way about anyone in a very long time." "Since when?" she asked, which was a more specific question than most people would have asked. "Since my wife died," he said. 7 years ago, in Missouri, a fever." Wilhelmina absorbed this with the quiet, undramatic compassion that was her particular style, not rushing to fill the silence with reassurance or deflection. "I am sorry," she said, "genuinely." "I know you are," he said. "That is one of the things about you." "What things?" she asked with a slight, real smile. "The things that make it impossible to not feel what I feel," Roy said. Outside, the Kansas wind had shifted, carrying the first real cold of autumn, and inside the jail office 2 people stood in the warmth of a lamp and acknowledged, without performance or pretense, that something had happened to them that was larger than the case, larger than the land, larger than the particular dangerous moment they were living through, and that it was, despite everything, welcome. The last week before the hearing was the most dangerous, and Roy knew it. Hargrove, realizing that bribery and intimidation were not achieving their intended effects, had shifted to his final available instrument, which was the judge himself. Judge Harlan Moorfield was not an evil man in the way that Hargrove was. He was a small man made smaller by circumstance and debt, a circuit judge who had borrowed money from the wrong people years ago and had been paying for it in ways he could not put in official records ever since. Hargrove had leveraged that debt precisely, and Moorfield had arrived in Caldwell, already inclined toward a ruling that had nothing to do with justice. Roy discovered this through a conversation that he was not supposed to overhear between Moorfield's clerk and one of Webb's legal assistants, overheard in the back room of the Drovers Hotel, where Roy had gone ostensibly to check on a noise complaint, and actually to observe what could be observed. He left the hotel with the information and a cold, clear understanding of what it meant. If Moorfield could not be trusted, then the testimony that Roy and Pettigrew and Wilhelmina's assembled evidence could offer had to be so airtight, so publicly documented, so absolutely witnessed by the largest possible number of citizens, that Moorfield could not rule against it without exposing himself to the consequences of blatant corruption before an audience that would not stay quiet. Roy spent 2 days making sure every respectable citizen of Caldwell knew about the hearing. That word had gone out to neighboring homesteaders and small ranchers that the gallery would be full. He filed a formal notice with the county commissioner's office, creating an official record of the complaint and the evidence, so that any ruling made without considering it would be documented dereliction. He wrote to the state attorney's office in Topeka, a letter that would take time to return a response but whose existence, if Moorfield were informed of it, might give him sufficient pause. And he stayed close to Wilhelmina. This was not hardship. In the days before the hearing, they fell into a rhythm that was both professional and personal, sharing meals at the small restaurant near Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house where the food was plain and good, reviewing evidence over afternoon coffee at his office, walking in the evenings along the quieter streets of Caldwell, while the October sky turned extraordinary colors above the flat Kansas horizon, and they talked about everything that mattered and some things that didn't. And in the talking built the particular architecture of 2 people who have decided to be entirely known by each other. She told him about her mother, who had died when Wilhelmina was 12, back in St. Louis, and about the years after when it had been just her and her father, when she had learned to be both the daughter and the practical partner he needed, when she had learned that the combination of warmth and pragmatism was not a contradiction but a particular kind of strength. He told her about the war, not the fighting, which he spoke of rarely and she did not press, but about what came after, the particular aimlessness of a young man who had seen too much and needed to find a way to be useful in a world that had been cracked in ways that had not yet healed. He told her about Kansas, about the way the sky here seemed bigger than anywhere else, about the moment he had pinned on the sheriff's star and felt for the first time in years like he was standing in the right place. "You love this work," she said one evening, watching his face as he talked about it. "I love the purpose of it," he said. "The work itself is sometimes miserable. But you do it anyway," she said. "Don't you?" he said. "The land is not easy. Homesteading is not a gentle life." "No," she agreed. "But it is mine." Roy looked at her in the fading light and thought, with a clarity that felt like the prairie at dawn, clean and enormous and entirely real, that he wanted this woman to be his. Not in the possessive sense that the era sometimes permitted men to mean such things, but in the reciprocal sense, the sense of belonging to each other the way 2 people belong to each other when they have chosen without reservation. He did not say it yet. There was a hearing in 4 days, and the outcome was not secured, and he was a man who believed in finishing what he started before beginning something new. But he knew it with the same certainty with which he knew everything that mattered to him. The night before the hearing, he found Wilhelmina on the porch of Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house, sitting in one of the wooden chairs with a cup of tea going cold in her hands and her eyes on the October stars above Caldwell, which were brilliant and numerous in the clear, cold air. "Can you sleep?" he asked. "No," she said. He sat in the chair beside her and they were quiet together for a while, which required its own kind of trust, the trust of 2 people who have decided that silence between them is not emptiness but companionship. "What happens if he rules against us?" Wilhelmina asked. not with defeat in her voice, but with the practical directness of a woman who faces possibilities rather than pretending they do not exist. "Then we appeal," Roy said. "Then I personally escort the evidence to the state attorney in Topeka. Then I make enough noise through every official channel available to me that the fraud becomes impossible to sustain. It will take longer, it will be harder, but it will not end here." "You would do that," she said. "Not a question." "I would," he said. "I am not finished with this case, regardless of what Moorfield rules tomorrow." She turned her head and looked at him in the porch light, and what was in her face was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life, a particular quality of being utterly seen and utterly accepted and feeling both things at the same time without flinching. "Roy," she said quietly. "Wilhelmina," he said, equally quiet. "After this is over," she said, choosing her words with the care she gave to everything, "I would like very much to not go back to the farm alone." The directness of it, the complete absence of coyness or manipulation or calculated positioning, hit him somewhere below the sternum with the specific warmth of something true. "I was going to ask you," he said, "to let me come and visit when this is over officially." "I would like that very much," she said. "And I was going to ask," he said, his voice steady and entirely certain, "whether you might consider in time not having to choose between the farm and Caldwell." She held his eyes. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" "I am saying it imprecisely," he admitted, "because the precise version requires a better moment than the night before a courthouse hearing. But yes, I am saying that." She reached out and took his hand in both of hers, and they sat on Mrs. Hennessy's porch under the Kansas stars, two people who had found each other in the middle of someone else's attempt to destroy everything, and they held on to each other in the specific way of people who understand that some things are worth fighting for, and some things are worth waiting for, and some things are, against all reasonable expectation, both at once. In the morning, they went to the hearing. The grain exchange on the corner of Main and Prairie Street was packed before the doors were officially opened, because Roy had done his work well, and the citizens of Caldwell understood that what was being decided inside those plank walls had implications beyond Wilhelmina Turner's 320 acres. This was about whether the most powerful man in the county could manufacture legal documents and acquire land by fraud, and have the whole arrangement ratified by a circuit court judge. This was, in the specific way of the frontier where the law was new, and its integrity was not yet settled into habit, about what kind of place Caldwell was going to be. Judge Moorfield had arrived with his court clerk and his traveling case, and the expression of a man who wanted to get this over with quickly and ride on to his next engagement. He had established his borrowed bench, called the court to order, and allowed Hargrove's attorney Aldous Webb to present his client's claim with an efficiency that suggested he had previewed the argument at length. Webb was smooth and practiced, presenting the forged deed with the confidence of a man who believes his forgery to be undetectable, outlining the purported transaction between Harold Turner and the Hargrove Land and Cattle Company with elaborate legal detail, and dismissing Wilhelmina Turner's complaint as the natural and understandable grief of a daughter unable to accept her father's legitimate business decision. And then Roy Whitaker had walked to the center of that floor and said the words that had sent the room into uproar. "That deed was stolen, and I have the witness to prove it." Now, in the chaos of Hargrove's fury and Moorfield's visible anxiety, and the crowd's explosive reaction, Roy stood absolutely still and waited for the noise to settle the way a man waits for a storm to pass when he knows the structure he is standing in is solid. Judge Moorfield, after considerable effort to reestablish order, looked at Roy with the expression of a man doing rapid arithmetic in his head, calculating the variables of his situation and arriving at an uncomfortable conclusion about the size of the audience and the implications of the official records Roy had already filed. "Sheriff Whitaker," Moorfield said, and his voice was tight but composed, "you may present your witness." Aldous Webb was on his feet immediately, objecting on procedural grounds, but Roy had anticipated this, and he spoke over the objection with the particular quality of a man who has done his preparation and knows exactly where the law stands. Your Honor, the rules of civil procedure for the state of Kansas permit new witness testimony to be introduced in cases of fraud when the witness is material to the question of document authenticity. I have filed the witness notice with the County Commissioner's office as required. The filing is dated 5 days ago and is part of the official record. Moorfield looked at his clerk, who confirmed this with a nod, and Webb's objection withered. Roy walked to the door of the grain exchange and opened it, and Pettigrew walked in. The clerk was pale and his hands were not entirely steady, but he walked to the witness position that Roy indicated with the courage of a man who has decided that the cost of cowardice is higher than the cost of doing right. His wife and child were, at that moment, in the room above the jail with Samuel Birch outside the door, and the knowledge of that had clearly steadied him. Roy asked his questions with the economy of a man who knows exactly what he needs and does not waste a syllable reaching for it. When? What did you see? Who was present? What did Webb say to Fitch? What date did he instruct Fitch to use on the notarization? When did Harold Turner die? Pettigrew answered each question in the clear, direct voice of a man telling the truth to a room that needed to hear it. And with each answer the color in Hargrove's face shifted through new and unpleasant registers. And Aldous Webb's practiced composure developed visible cracks. And Judge Moorfield sat very still with the expression of a man who has been handed an exit from a compromising situation and is calculating whether to take it. Webb's cross-examination of Pettigrew was aggressive and personal, attacking his credibility, his motives, his character, and Roy watched Pettigrew hold his ground through all of it with the steady composure of a man who is telling the truth and knows that the truth does not shift under pressure. When Webb implied that Pettigrew had been coached and compensated for his testimony, Pettigrew looked directly at the packed gallery and said, in a voice that carried to every corner, "I was not paid a cent. I am here because what I saw was wrong, and I am not willing to let it stand without saying so." The gallery responded to this with the kind of murmur that is not noise but consensus. Roy then introduced the documentation. The copy of the fraudulent deed with its suspect notarization, the records of Orville Fitch's previous investigations in Topeka, the hotel register from the Drovers showing Fitch's stay in Caldwell in late August, and the timeline Roy had prepared showing the dates of Harold Turner's death, his daughter's journey to Wichita, and the subsequent filing of the fraudulent transfer. He called Wilhelmina to testify about the timeline herself, and she took the witness position with the composure of someone who has been through grief and threat and the slow erosion of bureaucratic injustice, and has arrived on the other side of all of it at a place of absolute bedrock certainty. She spoke about her father, about his absolute refusal to sell his land under any circumstances, about returning from Wichita to find the strongbox broken and the deed gone, about discovering the fraudulent filing at the county clerk's office. She was precise and unflinching, and so obviously, entirely credible that even Webb's prolonged cross-examination produced nothing useful except, perhaps, the growing impatience of a judge who was beginning to understand that the only version of this hearing that did not destroy him personally was the one that arrived at the correct verdict. Roy concluded by laying before the judge the letter he had sent to the state attorney in Topeka, noting that a copy of all evidence had been provided and that the state office had been apprised of the hearing. "Your Honor," Roy said, "this is not a complicated matter. It is a fraud clearly evidenced, credibly witnessed, and documented. The only question before this court is whether the law of the state of Kansas will be applied equally to all persons, regardless of their wealth or influence. I have every confidence that it will." This last sentence was directed as much at the packed gallery as at Moorfield, and everyone in the room understood it. Judge Moorfield called a recess. He returned in 40 minutes, and his expression had undergone a visible adjustment. the expression of a small man who has decided, perhaps for the first time in several years, to be larger. "This court finds," Moorfield said, in a voice that had recovered its official steadiness, "that the deed transfer presented by the Hargrove Land and Cattle Company bears indications of fraudulent preparation, including a false notarization date and a date of transaction inconsistent with the documented death of the original landholder. The court further finds the testimony of County Clerk Martin Pettigrew to be credible and material. The deed transfer dated June 14, 1882, filed on behalf of the Hargrove Land and Cattle Company, is hereby declared null and void. The original deed registered to Harold Turner in 1875 is confirmed as the valid title document. The property of 320 acres described therein passes to his legal heir, Wilhelmina Turner, in accordance with Kansas inheritance law. He also ordered that the matter of the fraudulent notarization be referred to the state attorney's office for investigation, and that Aldous Webb's conduct be reported to the Kansas bar for review. Cornelius Hargrove stood up at the plaintiff's table, and for one charged moment the room held its breath, waiting to see which version of the man would speak, the powerful baron or the cornered animal. Then Webb grabbed his arm with the force of a lawyer who still had a law license to protect, and whatever Hargrove had been about to say was swallowed in the strangled silence of a man who knows he has lost and has not yet decided what to do about it. What he eventually did about it, over the following weeks and months, was nothing legally effective. The state attorney's investigation moved with the particular efficient momentum of an office that had been waiting for precisely this kind of documented complaint, and within 6 months Aldous Webb had surrendered his law license, and Orville Fitch was facing criminal charges in Topeka, and Cornelius Hargrove himself was under investigation for the pattern of fraudulent land transfers that Wilhelmina's careful research had documented. The empire contracted. The power receded. It did not happen overnight, and it was not perfect, and some of the land that other small homesteaders had lost was not entirely recovered, and Roy knew that this was the particular, imperfect justice that was the best the law could sometimes deliver. But it was something real, and it was more than what had existed before. None of that, however, was what Roy was thinking about in the immediate aftermath of the ruling, when the gallery erupted, and people were pressing forward to speak to Wilhelmina, and Pettigrew's wife, Clara, had come through the door with her infant, and her husband's relief was visible across the room like a flag unfurling. Roy stood back and watched Wilhelmina Turner accept the congratulations of the Caldwell citizens around her with the grace and genuine warmth of someone who has been holding everything in tension for weeks and can finally feel it release. She was luminous. She was completely, specifically herself. She turned in the crowd and found his eyes across the packed room, and the look that passed between them had nothing to do with the case or the ruling or the packed gallery, and everything to do with what both of them already knew. Later, when the grain exchange had emptied and the afternoon had reached that particular October quality of golden slanted light that makes the Kansas prairie look like something out of a painting, Roy found Wilhelmina on the front step of the building, her hat in her hands and her dark hair coming loose from its pins in the wind, and he stood beside her, and they looked out at Caldwell's Main Street together in a silence that was entirely, perfectly companionable. "It is over," she said. "This part is over," he said. She turned to look at him, and there was a question in her eyes that she was choosing to ask directly because it was her way. "What is the next part?" she asked. Roy Whitaker was not a man who had ever been accused of excessive romanticism or elaborate declaration, but he had spent 6 weeks in the company of a woman who had taught him, by example, that directness and honesty were not enemies of tenderness but its most reliable allies, and so he looked at her in the October light and said the true thing. "The next part is that I would like to court you properly," he said. "Visit the farm on weekends, ride out when I can get Samuel to cover. Learn the land the way you know it, and in time If you will have me, ask you to marry me and figure out together what the life looks like after that." Wilhelmina Turner looked at this man, this iron-jawed, winter-eyed, entirely honest, inconveniently good man who had walked into the most dangerous situation available to him for her sake without hesitation, and she felt something settle inside her chest that had been in motion for a very long time, since before her father died, since before she had come west at all, the particular restlessness of a person who is capable of enormous love and has not yet found the right place for it. "Yes," she said, simply and entirely. He took her hand, and they stood in the October light in front of the grain exchange on the corner of Main and Prairie Street in Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882, and the future opened ahead of them like the prairie itself, enormous and clear and full of everything that work and love and honesty could build. The courtship was exactly what Roy had described. Weekend rides south to the Turner farm, which she had returned to with a determination that impressed even the neighbors who had known Harold Turner and thought themselves inured to impressive determination. She was on the land within a week of the ruling, reestablishing the cattle routine, assessing what needed repair, beginning the work of the wheat field before the autumn planting season entirely closed. Roy rode out every Saturday he could manage, which was most of them, and Samuel Birch, who was the most reliable deputy in Kansas, and who had privately made his own assessment of the situation and approved of it completely, covered the office with cheerful competence. What happened on those Saturday visits was a season of discovery that Roy would later describe, in private moments of reflection, as the best education of his life. Wilhelmina knew every inch of that land the way only someone who has worked it for years can know a piece of country, its moods and demands and rewards, the places where the creek ran fast and cold even in late summer, the slope of the west field that caught the wind just so, and needed a windbreak planted in the right position, the quality of the soil in the north section that was richer than it looked and would, she was certain, support a second wheat plot if properly prepared. She taught him things about farming that he had not known, and he taught her things about tracking and reading country signs that she had not known, and in the exchange of knowledge between them was the particular intimacy of two people taking genuine interest in how each other's minds worked. He also, on those Saturdays, met the neighbors who had been Harold Turner's community, the Pearson family to the south with their 6 children and their scrubby but determined little ranch, the Beaumont widow to the east who was managing 40 acres alone and doing it with spectacular stubbornness, and a half-dozen other homesteaders scattered across the rolling land who between them represented the human reality of what Hargrove had been trying to acquire and destroy. They were cautious with Roy at first, because a sheriff represented a power that had not always been on their side, but they had heard what happened at the hearing, and Wilhelmina's trust was a credential that carried weight, and within a few visits Roy had become a familiar and welcome presence in that small community. In November, on a Saturday that had turned cold enough for the first real frost of the season, Roy sat with Wilhelmina at her father's kitchen table after supper, while the wind pressed against the farmhouse windows and the lamp threw warm circles around their cups of coffee, and he asked her. He had thought about elaborate preparation and decided that she would prefer the honest version, which was what he had. Himself, his word, his willingness to build whatever life they decided to build together with the same stubbornness and care that she brought to her wheat and her cattle and everything she valued. "Wilhelmina," he said, "I am asking you to marry me. I am asking with the understanding that this land is yours, and I am not asking you to give it up or diminish it or choose it over me, because I intend to be the kind of man you never have to make that choice with. I am asking because I love you, clearly, entirely, and without reservation." She looked at him across her father's kitchen table, in the house her father had built board by board, on the land her father had believed in enough to spend his life on, and her eyes were bright and her voice was absolutely steady when she said, "Roy Whitaker, I have loved you since approximately the 4th day of our acquaintance, which I consider embarrassingly swift for a woman of my particular temperament. And yes, I will marry you." He leaned across the table and kissed her, and the frost pressed against the windows outside, and the lamp burned warm and steady between them. They were married in Caldwell in December of 1882, in the small Methodist church on the east side of town, in a ceremony attended by Samuel Birch and his wife, the Pearson family who had driven 40 miles in a wagon through December cold to be there, Mrs. Hennessy from the boarding house, and most of the town of Caldwell, which had adopted the story of Wilhelmina Turner and the iron-jawed sheriff as its own in the way that small communities adopt stories that confirm what they want to believe about themselves. Martin Pettigrew was there with Clara and their baby son, who had been named Harold, which had made Wilhelmina cry in the specific, unguarded way of someone who has been strong for a very long time and is occasionally permitted to be something else. Pettigrew had kept his clerk position because the county commissioner, who was not in Hargrove's pocket, had made clear that a man who testified truthfully at personal risk deserved professional security, and Pettigrew had become, Roy thought, the better version of himself that the situation had demanded of him. The reception was in the grain exchange, which had become in Roy's mind permanently associated with the beginning of everything, and the food was enormous in quantity and excellent in quality, because Wilhelmina had learned to cook on the prairie with her father and had opinions about proper provision for a gathering that were both strong and justified. They danced, which was something Roy had not done in years and which turned out to be something Wilhelmina was considerably better at than he was, and she guided him through the gaps in his technique with the same direct, patient humor she brought to everything, and he let himself be guided, which was its own kind of knowledge about who they were to each other. Late in the evening, they stood together at the edge of the room and watched the gathering around them with the particular satisfaction of two people who have earned their happiness and know it, and Wilhelmina leaned against Roy's arm and said, "My father would have liked you." "I would have liked to meet him," Roy said. "He would have tested you," she said. "He had a way of asking questions that seemed like conversation but were actually examination. You would have passed." "How do you know?" Roy asked. "Because you are the kind of man he always hoped I would find," she said. "Someone honest enough to be worth the trouble and stubborn enough to be worth keeping." Roy Whitaker, iron-jawed sheriff of Sumner County, pressed a kiss to the top of his new wife's head and thought that he was, beyond any reasonable expectation, the luckiest man in Kansas. They decided, after considerable practical discussion, on an arrangement that suited both their natures and their responsibilities. Roy kept his position as sheriff because the county needed him and because the work mattered to him in ways that Wilhelmina understood completely and respected entirely. He kept his office and his quarters in Caldwell during the week. On weekends and on whatever days duty permitted, he rode south to the farm. Wilhelmina kept the farm because it was hers and her father's, and because she was not built for town life and had no ambition toward it. But she came to Caldwell regularly, which meant she became a familiar and respected figure in the town, known for her intelligence and her directness and her absolute inability to tolerate nonsense in any form. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that weathers people together, full of the ordinary, extraordinary demands of two lives being built into one. There was the wheat to plant and the cattle to tend, and the fence line that needed substantial repair after a January storm, and the investigation in Topeka that required Roy to testify twice, traveling up with his documentation and returning each time to the farm rather than to his Caldwell quarters, because he was no longer, in any meaningful sense, a man who lived alone. There was the spring of 1883, when one of the Pearson children got lost in a late-season blizzard, and Roy and Wilhelmina organized the search together with the quiet, efficient coordination of two people who have learned each other's strengths. And the child was found cold and frightened but alive, wrapped in a hollow beneath a riverbank. And the relief of that finding was the kind of shared experience that welds people together at a level below the ordinary bonds. In the late summer of 1883, Wilhelmina told Roy that she was expecting their first child. She told him on a Saturday evening at the kitchen table with the directness that was entirely characteristic of her, and Roy received the news with a quality of feeling that surprised him in its intensity, a fullness that he had not known to anticipate, and that left him, for one of the rare moments in his life, entirely without words. He recovered them. He stood up and took her face in his hands and told her that he loved her, and that he was more grateful than he had words for, and that he intended to be the best possible father and husband within the limits of his demonstrated abilities. And she laughed, which was one of the sounds he loved most in the world, genuine and unguarded and warm. Their son was born in the spring of 1884, in the farmhouse her father had built, with a midwife from Raydrock and Roy present against all local convention and completely indifferent to the convention, because he was not leaving, and they named him Harold James Whitaker, Harold for her father and James for Roy's father, and the combining of names felt like the combining of histories into something new. Harold James Whitaker was a large, loud, imperious baby who had his mother's gray-green eyes and his father's jaw, and both Roy and Wilhelmina found this combination so entertaining that they mentioned it frequently enough that Samuel Birch, when he came to visit, told them with the affectionate exasperation of a close friend that they were going to be insufferable parents. He was not wrong, and neither of them was remotely concerned about this. Roy's tenure as sheriff continued through the 80s, and the county continued to change around them in the ways that the frontier always changes. The gradual arrival of more people, more towns, more railroads, more law, the slow replacement of the violent and uncertain with the merely complicated and occasionally corrupt, which was a different kind of challenge but one Roy had developed considerable expertise in navigating. He was re-elected twice without opposition, which he found embarrassing and Wilhelmina found gratifying. The investigation into Cornelius Hargrove's land acquisition scheme proceeded through the state system, with the methodical momentum of an official inquiry that has strong documentation and clear public support. By 1884, Hargrove had agreed to a settlement that returned significant sums to the families whose lands had been acquired through fraudulent means, though not all the land itself could be returned due to subsequent transactions, and Hargrove faced a substantial financial penalty that, while it did not destroy his enterprise entirely, diminished it considerably and permanently. The powerful man had been made smaller, not powerless but accountable, which was the best that law could sometimes do. Roy sent official notification of the settlement to Wilhelmina while he was in Caldwell and she was at the farm, and she received it on a Tuesday morning in March, standing in the doorway of the farmhouse with Harold James on her hip and the spring wind coming in from the west, and she read it twice and then folded it carefully and held it against her chest for a moment, feeling the weight of what it represented, her father's name vindicated, the land confirmed, the fraud answered. She wrote Roy a letter that evening that contained, among other things, the sentence, "I think my father would sleep peacefully now, which makes me feel something I do not have a precise word for, but it is good, and it is real, and it is partly because of you." Roy read that letter in his Caldwell office on a Thursday morning and read it again, and then folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, where it stayed for the rest of that day and well into the next. In 1885, the Turner farm expanded. Roy had been saving money from his sheriff's salary with a specific purpose in mind, and Wilhelmina had been investing the income from the wheat harvest with the careful ambition of someone who knows the value of what she has built and wants to build it larger. And together, they had the resources to acquire the 40 acres to the east that the Beaumont widow, who was nearly 70 and had finally agreed to go live with her daughter in Topeka, was willing to sell at a price that recognized the years of neighborly goodwill between the two properties. 360 acres, with the water rights that Roy had spent a professional month ensuring were properly documented and registered in both their names. Wilhelmina stood at the edge of the new East Field on the afternoon the papers were signed, and looked out over the land that was now entirely, unambiguously, legally theirs. And she was quiet in a way that Roy had learned to read as the silence of someone who is feeling something too large for immediate expression. He stood beside her in the way he had learned to stand beside her, close and present and undemanding. "He would have seen this and known it was what he wanted for me," she said finally, meaning her father. The land, the security, the fighting for what was right, he would have seen it and been satisfied. "And what do you see?" Roy asked. She turned to look at him, and what was in her face was everything. The love that had grown from the improbable beginning of a woman walking into a sheriff's office with rage and a stolen deed, the pride of the land and the life she had built on it, the warmth of the family she was building on it, and beneath all of that, steady and sure as the creek that never ran dry even in the hottest summer, the knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be with exactly the person she was supposed to be with. "I see everything I want," she said. Their second child was born in 1886, a daughter they named Eleanor Ruth Whitaker, who arrived with all the emphasis of a person who had decided opinions about her own importance and the world's obligation to recognize it, a quality that Roy found entirely familiar and Wilhelmina found hilarious. Harold James, who was 2.5 by the time Eleanor Ruth arrived, received his sister with the mixture of curiosity and proprietorial suspicion that is the natural response of a small child to a new competitor for parental attention, and Roy watched his son assess the situation with eyes that were already, recognizably, his mother's, and felt a quality of joy that still, even now, surprised him with its completeness. Life on the Kansas prairie in the late 1880s was not without its hardships, because the prairie was not a place that offered comfort as a default. There were dry summers and blizzard winters and market fluctuations that affected the price of wheat and cattle in ways that required constant adjustment and occasional difficult decisions. There was the year the creek flooded and took out the south fence line, and 3 weeks of repair work that left Roy with a profound respect for what his wife did 6 days of every week, with a composure that he found quietly astonishing. There was the year a drought came in hard from the west, and Wilhelmina made a series of irrigation decisions based on her years of watching the land that saved the wheat crop, when 3 neighboring farms lost theirs entirely, and the Pearson family and 2 others came to her afterward, with the kind of gratitude that meant they would have stood beside her in any difficulty thereafter without being asked. Roy's last term as sheriff ended in 1889, when he was 48 years old, and the county had grown large enough and organized enough that a new, younger man with different skills was probably better suited to its different demands. He did not regret the end of it. He had served 17 years in total, which was longer than he had ever imagined when he had taken the star, and he had done the work with the full force of his honest, stubborn, iron-jawed nature, and he was ready, in the way that a person is ready when they have finished something completely, to move to the next thing. The next thing was the farm. He moved to the Turner farm permanently in the spring of 1889, and what happened over the following years was the life that both of them, separately and without knowing about each other, had been moving toward for their entire adult lives. He applied to the farm the same methodical, observant intelligence that had made him a good sheriff, learning the land as well as Wilhelmina knew it, contributing different knowledge that combined with hers to make the whole operation sharper and more resilient. He built things, because it turned out that he was good with his hands in ways that years of office work and law enforcement had not had much occasion to express, And the farmhouse grew a proper parlor addition in 1890 and a better barn in 1891. Harold James grew up on that land with the particular combination of qualities that both parents had contributed: his mother's intelligence and directness, his father's steadiness and patience, and a stubbornness that was approximately equal contribution from both sides, and that Wilhelmina observed. When Harold James was about 9 and engaged in a determined argument about chore schedule, was either going to make him very successful or very difficult, and possibly both. Elena Ruth grew up to be a small force of nature who had apparently inherited the most concentrated version of every strong quality both her parents possessed, and who, by the time she was old enough to understand the story of the stolen deed and the circuit court hearing, had adopted it as a personal founding myth, and would tell it to anyone who visited the farm with the particular relish of a child who understands that their family's story is exceptional. "Your grandfather's land," Wilhelmina told her daughter, one evening when Elena was perhaps 7, sitting at the kitchen table while the lamp burned and Roy was outside with Harold James checking on a new calf, "was almost taken by a dishonest man. And your father walked into a courthouse and said the truth out loud in front of everyone, and the truth was enough." "Was it always enough?" Elena asked, with the directness of a child who has been raised to ask real questions. "Not always," Wilhelmina said honestly. "Sometimes the truth needs someone brave enough to carry it. Your father was that person." "Were you brave too?" Elena asked. Wilhelmina thought about this with genuine consideration, the way she thought about everything. "I was desperate first," she said, "and then I found my footing, and then I was brave. I think that is usually how it works." Elena considered this information with the gravity of a 7-year-old absorbing a lesson she intends to use. Roy came back inside with Harold James behind him, both of them bringing the cool evening air and the smell of the stable. And Roy looked across the kitchen at his wife in the lamplight, and she looked back at him. And in the look between them was everything that 7 years of building a life together had made. The particular depth of two people who have chosen each other daily in the specific, unromantic, entirely romantic sense of choosing each other in the difficult moments as much as the easy ones. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her, which prompted Harold James to make a noise of theatrical disgust and Elena Ruth to say, "Again," with a tone that managed to be both exasperated and fundamentally satisfied with the state of affairs. "Again," Roy confirmed, without turning away from his wife, and Wilhelmina laughed, and the lamp burned warm and steady in the farmhouse that Harold Turner had built board by board on the land he had believed in, and outside the Kansas stars were clear and innumerable above the prairie that stretched to every horizon without apology or limitation. And inside that farmhouse the life that had begun with a stolen deed and a woman's fury, and a sheriff's honest stubbornness, was fully, completely, joyfully itself. They had a third child in 1893, another son they named Thomas Roy Whitaker, who arrived with the calm, observant quality of someone who has taken a long look at the existing situation and decided it is generally satisfactory. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, which Elena Ruth greeted by saying it was unfair that she had not received either of these distinguishing features, and Harold James greeted by pointing out that she had received everything else. Roy, at 52, holding his new son in the farmhouse that had grown and changed with the family it contained, looked at Wilhelmina across the room where she was sitting up in bed with the composed, fierce grace of a woman who has done difficult things and emerged from them with her fundamental quality intact, and he thought about the particular chain of events that had led to this moment. A stolen deed, a 40-mile ride, a door pushed open. The truth spoken out loud in a packed grain exchange before a reluctant judge who had, in the end, chosen to be larger than his compromises. It was, he thought, the most unlikely and the most inevitable love story he could have imagined. "What are you thinking about?" Wilhelmina asked, because she had 17 years of practice at reading his silences and knew the difference between the ones that wanted space and the ones that wanted voice. "About the courtroom," he said, In the grain exchange, October of 1882, she smiled, the real smile that she gave to very few people and always to him. That was not a very romantic beginning. No, he agreed, but it was an honest one. It was the right beginning, she said, for us. He brought Thomas Roy to her and sat on the edge of the bed beside her. And through the farmhouse window, the Kansas evening was moving toward night in the slow, magnificent way of the prairie in autumn. All space and color, and the particular quality of peace that comes when the work of the day is done, and the work of the life is going well, and the people you love are near enough to touch. Harold Turner's land, 160 acres grown to 380 by patience and work, and the stubborn refusal to be defeated, lay around that farmhouse like a promise kept, the wheat fields and the cattle range and the 2 creek beds that never ran dry, and above it all the sky that Roy had come west to find and found and never stopped being grateful for. The circuit court case became, in the way of frontier stories that contain the elements people need to tell, a piece of local history that was passed down through the community, the story of the iron-jawed sheriff and the woman who would not be moved, told in parlors and saloons and around fires by people who had been there, and people who had heard it from people who had been there, each telling carrying the essential truth forward. That in the autumn of 1882, in the new state of Kansas, a man had stood up in a courtroom and told the truth to power, and a woman had stood behind that truth with everything she had, and the outcome had been justice, which was not always what happened but was. What happened that time, and which was therefore worth remembering. Wilhelmina Turner Whitaker lived on that land until she was 74 years old, and she farmed it to the last decade of her life with the same fierce, practical love that she had brought to everything she had ever valued. Roy Whitaker died at 70, in the farmhouse they had made together, with his wife and 3 children and several grandchildren present, and Wilhelmina sat with him in the last hours and held his hand, and they talked the way they had always talked, directly and without performance, and with the full weight of people who have given each other everything and known themselves the richer for it. Their children and their children's children kept the land, as it had always been intended to be kept, with work and love and the specific stubbornness that Harold Turner had planted in his daughter, and that she had, in her particular way, passed on to everyone she loved. And in the county records of Sumner County, Kansas, the deed to the Turner farm, filed in 1875 and confirmed in 1882 following the hearing in the Caldwell grain exchange, stood clear and unencumbered and entirely legible. A document that said, in the plain and specific language of legal transfer, that the land belonged to the person who had earned it, and that no fraud, however carefully constructed, had been able to stand against the simple, enormous force of the truth spoken plainly by a man who refused to look away from it. It was, in the end, exactly as it should have been.